For decades, the Everglades belonged to one reptile above all others. Then something started swallowing it whole. Florida's swamps have a new nightmare, and it isn't coming from overseas this time. It's rising out of the water itself, jaws first, and it's been quietly turning the tables on the most feared invasive predator in North America, the Burmese python. If you follow the python crisis in Florida, you know the story so far. Snakes that can grow past 18 feet long, thick as a fire hydrant, showing up in a swamp where they have no business being. Pets released or escaped decades ago, breeding out of control and swallowing their way through the Everglades food web. Rabbits gone. Foxes gone. Marsh rabbits practically wiped off the map in some areas. Bobcat and opossum numbers crushed. For years, the pythons had almost no real threat. They were the apex predator with no natural check, and Florida's wildlife agencies threw everything at them. Bounty hunts, radio-tagged scout snakes, professional trackers, walking the sawgrass with machetes. Millions of dollars, thousands of pythons removed, and the population barely blinked. But something has changed in the swamp. Florida's original apex predator has started fighting back, and the footage coming out of the Everglades over the past few years is brutal enough to make you rethink who actually rules that ecosystem. The alligator is swallowing the python. Let that sink in for a second, because it flips the entire narrative most people have in their heads. For years, the image burned into the public consciousness was the opposite. A python wrapped around a full-grown gator, squeezing the life out of it, sometimes even attempting to eat it. That image is real. It happened. Back in 2006, rangers in Everglades National Park found a 13-foot Burmese python that had tried to swallow a 6-foot alligator whole and lost. The python's stomach ruptured under the pressure, and both animals ended up dead, frozen in one of the most infamous photographs to ever come out of the park. That single image became the symbol of everything terrifying about the python invasion. If a snake could burst trying to eat a gator, what chance did anything smaller have? For a long time, that photo told the whole story. Pythons ate alligators. Alligators, on paper, were prey. But biologists watching the swamp for the last several years have started documenting the opposite outcome again and again, and it's becoming impossible to ignore. Start with the encounter that went viral and reignited the whole debate. A volunteer named Allison Joslin was riding her bike through the Shark Valley section of Everglades National Park in December of 2023 when she spotted something thrashing in the water near the observation tower. She stopped, looked closer, and realized she was watching an alligator with a massive Burmese python clamped in its jaws, not fighting it off, not defending itself, eating it. She said she genuinely thought both animals might already be dead until the gator cracked open one eye to look at her. Then it went right back to work on the snake. That wasn't a one-off. Joslin happened to be in the right place at the right time more than once. In August of the following year, she caught another alligator in almost the exact same stretch of water, chewing through the body of another huge python, eventually swimming off into deeper water with the carcass still locked in its jaws. Witnesses who found the scene noted the gator had apparently been guarding its kill for days, chasing off other alligators that tried to steal a piece of the carcass, the smell of the rotting python drifting across the water as it slowly finished its meal. Then there's the alligator nicknamed Godzilla. On Thanksgiving Day, wildlife watchers filmed an enormous alligator hauling a python carcass through the Everglades, the snake's body dwarfed in its jaws. The nickname stuck because of the sheer size of the gator involved. A reminder that the biggest, oldest alligators in the swamp are exactly the animals capable of taking down a python that would kill almost anything else that tried. None of this is anecdotal folklore anymore. Scientists have put numbers behind it. In a study published by the U.S. Geological Survey, researchers surgically implanted radio transmitters into baby Burmese pythons and released them back into the Everglades to track their movements and survival. The goal was to study python behavior, but the study ended up documenting something else entirely: predation. Several of those tagged pythons were killed and eaten by alligators before the study even finished collecting its behavioral data. The transmitters that were supposed to be tracking a predator started tracking prey instead. And it's not just alligators. Researchers studying the Everglades have built up a growing list of native Florida predators willing to take on a python, especially when the snake is small, young, or already weakened. The Gulf Coast indigo snake, a massive muscular native snake in its own right, has been documented preying on juvenile pythons. Bobcats have been caught on camera raiding python nests, killing the hatchlings before they ever get the chance to grow into the apex predators their parents became. There's even documented evidence pointing to Florida black bears going after nests. And cottonmouths, one of Florida's most feared venomous snakes, have been recorded preying on young pythons as well, according to researchers tracking predator-prey interactions across the greater Everglades ecosystem. Put all of that together, and you start to see the shape of what's actually happening out there. It isn't one apex predator conquering another in a single dramatic battle. It's an ecosystem slowly, brutally recalibrating. For the first time since Burmese pythons established themselves in South Florida, native predators are demonstrating that they can kill them, not just occasionally, not just as a fluke, but as a repeatable documented pattern across multiple species in multiple locations. So why is this happening now, after 2 decades of pythons running the show? Part of the answer is simple biology. A newly hatched or juvenile python is vulnerable in a way an adult isn't. It's small enough for a bobcat, an indigo snake, or even a large wading bird to physically overpower. The problem for the ecosystem has never really been about whether something could kill a baby python. It's about how many baby pythons survive long enough to become 12-foot adults with no predators left to fear. If native predators are hammering python nests and picking off hatchlings at a higher rate than previously realized, that's a meaningful dent in the population, even if it doesn't show up in a single viral video. The other part of the answer is about the specific vulnerability of adult pythons, and this is where alligators come back into the picture. A python's greatest weapon, constriction, only works when it can get its coils fully around something and maintain leverage. In open water against an animal built like an armored torpedo with a skull that can crush bone in a body built by 300 million years of evolutionary refinement, that advantage shrinks fast. Alligators have evolutionarily reinforced hide, incredible bite force, and the raw size, up to 15 feet and over 1,000 pounds in the biggest individuals, to simply overpower a python before it can get a fatal grip established. In the water, on the alligator's home turf, the python isn't necessarily the more dangerous animal anymore. There's also the matter of who has the manpower. Florida's alligator population is estimated at roughly 1.3 million animals spread across the state. Burmese pythons, despite 2 decades of explosive growth, are believed to occupy a range of just over 1,000 square miles in South Florida. Even with everything pythons have going for them, they are still vastly outnumbered on their own turf by an animal that has called those wetlands home for millions of years. None of this means the python invasion is solved. Biologists and wildlife officials have been careful and consistent about that point every time a new predation video goes viral. A single alligator eating a single python captured on video is a striking image, but it is not, on its own, a population-level solution. The python problem in Florida runs into the tens of thousands of snakes, by conservative estimates, spread across dense, nearly impenetrable sawgrass marsh and cypress swamp, where they are notoriously difficult for even trained hunters to find. Removing individual snakes, whether by hand or by alligator jaw, chips away at the edges of a problem that established itself over decades. But the documented predation does matter, and it matters for a specific reason. It's evidence that the Everglades ecosystem isn't entirely helpless against the invader. For years, the working assumption among a lot of biologists was bleak, that Burmese pythons had no real natural predator in Florida, that they had arrived into a power vacuum and simply filled it, unchallenged, the way an invasive species usually does when it lands somewhere with no evolutionary history of dealing with it. Every one of these encounters, every study documenting alligators, bobcats, indigo snakes, and black bears preying on pythons, chips away at that assumption. It suggests native wildlife is adapting in real time, learning to recognize a python as a viable, killable food source rather than an unstoppable invader. Wildlife officials in Florida have leaned into that framing publicly. Statements from groups monitoring the Everglades have described the trend as native alligators potentially serving as a first line of defense against the python invasion, language that would have sounded almost absurd a decade ago, when the python was consistently framed as the thing eating everything else in the swamp, alligators included. It's worth sitting with how strange this reversal actually is in ecological terms. Invasive species usually win. That's the entire reason they're considered invasive in the first place. They arrive somewhere with no natural predators, no evolutionary history with the local wildlife, and no biological brakes on their population growth. Cane toads in Australia, zebra mussels in the Great Lakes, lionfish in the Atlantic. In almost every case, the native ecosystem simply doesn't have the tools to fight back, at least not fast enough to matter. The python invasion in the Everglades looked for years like it was following that exact script. Native mammal populations collapsing. An apex predator with no real check on its numbers. A snake so large and so well adapted to the swamp that some biologists openly worried it could eventually push north out of South Florida into other wetland ecosystems entirely. What's happening now is a partial exception to that pattern. And it's happening because Florida's swamps already had an apex predator of their own. One that had spent millions of years perfecting exactly the kind of ambush, grip, and overwhelming force needed to kill something the size of a python. The alligator wasn't a new tool the ecosystem had to evolve from scratch. It was already sitting at the top of the food chain, and it turns out that top of the food chain skill set translates reasonably well to killing a new competitor. Once enough, individual alligators start recognizing pythons as food rather than as a stranger in the water. That's really the core of what's shifting. Predation isn't instinctive recognition of every possible prey item. Animals often have to learn what's edible, especially with something as unfamiliar as a species that didn't even exist in that ecosystem a few decades ago. Every video of an alligator successfully killing and eating a python is, in a sense, a data point suggesting that lesson is spreading. That's individual gators learning through trial and error, or simply larger sample sizes of naturally occurring predation being caught on camera more often thanks to the sheer number of visitors, researchers, and trail cameras now watching the Everglades. The pattern keeps repeating. There's also a colder, more mechanical explanation running underneath all of this. Population dynamics work both ways. As the python population expanded through the 2000s and 2010s, more pythons meant more encounters between pythons and alligators, simply as a matter of density. More encounters mean more opportunities for a python to lose a fight. It might have avoided a decade earlier, when there were fewer pythons around to bump into a hungry, territorial alligator in the first place. The gators didn't need to develop some brand new skill. They just needed enough chances to use the one they already had. None of that diminishes how genuinely dangerous these encounters are for both animals involved. Alligators don't win every fight. The 2021 footage of a python strangling an alligator to death in the Everglades is proof of that. A reminder that adult Burmese pythons remain fully capable of killing large native reptiles, including alligators, under the right circumstances. Pythons have also been documented preying on smaller, younger alligators outright, treating them the same way they'd treat a deer or a raccoon, as prey to be located, seized, and slowly crushed. The relationship between these two apex predators isn't a clean story of good guys and bad guys. It's a genuine, ongoing struggle for dominance in an ecosystem that never asked for a second top predator to begin with. What makes the current wave of alligator versus python footage so significant is the direction it points. For most of the python invasion's history, the visible violence flowed one way. Python versus everything else, python winning. Now there's a growing, documented body of evidence, viral cyclist footage, trail cam captures, and controlled scientific studies using radio telemetry, showing the fight going the other direction often enough that it can't be dismissed as a fluke anymore. Biologists tracking this shift are careful not to oversell it. Nobody studying the Everglades is claiming alligators are about to solve Florida's python problem. The python population is too large, too widely distributed, and too well hidden in terrain that makes human removal efforts exhausting and slow. Wildlife agencies are still running python bounty programs, still training hunters to track them through the sawgrass, still relying heavily on radio-tagged scout pythons, a male snake fitted with a tracker, and released specifically because, during mating season, he'll lead researchers straight to breeding females, who are then removed from the population along with any eggs they're carrying. That program alone has led to the removal of some of the largest pythons ever documented in Florida, including specimens pushing 9-10 feet long and weighing well over 100 pounds. But the predation data adds a layer to that fight that didn't really exist in the public narrative before. It suggests the python's dominance in the Everglades was never absolute. It was a dominance built on novelty, on arriving in an ecosystem that hadn't yet learned how to fight back. And ecosystems, given enough time and enough encounters, tend to adjust. The 2012 study, connecting python spread to steep declines in raccoons, opossums, bobcats, foxes, and rabbits, described an ecosystem in the early, chaotic stages of an invasion when native species hadn't yet adapted their behavior around a completely new kind of predator. More than a decade later, the animals still standing appear to be doing more than just surviving. Some of them are starting to bite back. It's a strange kind of hope for anyone who's followed how bleak the python story has sounded for the last 20 years. Nobody is calling this a victory. Wildlife officials aren't declaring the invasion contained. What they are pointing to, cautiously, is evidence that the Everglades isn't a passive victim in this fight anymore. The apex predator that ruled these waters for millions of years before a single python ever escaped into the sawgrass hasn't given up its throne without a fight. And increasingly, the camera footage backs that up. Somewhere under the surface of a Florida marsh tonight, there's a very good chance one of those fights is happening right now, out of sight. Decided the same way it's been decided a growing number of times in recent years. Not by the snake that terrorized the swamp for 2 decades, but by the reptile that was here long before it, closing its jaws and refusing to let go. To understand why any of this matters, it helps to rewind to how the python problem started in the first place, because the scale of what alligators and other native predators are now pushing back against is almost hard to comprehend. Burmese pythons are native to Southeast Asia, where they're actually listed as a vulnerable species due to habitat loss and hunting pressure in their home range. They became popular in the exotic pet trade throughout the late 20th century, prized for their size and their striking patterned skin. Some escaped. Some were deliberately released once owners realized just how large and unmanageable a snake that can grow past 18 feet actually becomes in a home enclosure. By the 1990s, breeding populations were established in the wetlands surrounding Everglades National Park, and from there, the snakes simply kept spreading. The Everglades turned out to be close to perfect for them. Warm, wet, dense with cover, and absolutely packed with prey that had no evolutionary experience with an ambush predator of that size. Native mammals in South Florida didn't recognize the python as a threat the way they might, instinctively recognize a bobcat or a hawk. There was no learned avoidance behavior, no generational memory of how to escape a python strike. The result was a slow-motion collapse of the small and mid-sized mammal population across large stretches of the park. Survey data collected by researchers driving established roads at night, counting live and roadkill animals, found staggering declines. Raccoon and opossum sightings dropped by more than 9 in every 10. Bobcat sightings fell by roughly 7 in 10. Marsh rabbits and cottontail rabbits, along with foxes, effectively disappeared from areas where pythons had become established the longest. In the parts of the park where pythons had only recently arrived, the same mammal populations were still holding relatively steady, which gave researchers a rare kind of natural experiment. They could watch a mammal community collapse in close to real time as the python's range expanded outward from its original point of establishment. That's the backdrop that makes the recent predation footage so significant. This isn't a story about one invasive species quietly fitting itself into an already balanced ecosystem. It's a story about a predator that arrived and, for the better part of 2 decades, seemed to face almost no consequences for wiping out huge portions of the local food web. Removal efforts by the state have always run into the same fundamental problem. Pythons are extraordinarily difficult to find. Their camouflage is close to perfect against the mottled browns and greens of sawgrass and cypress knee terrain, and they spend enormous amounts of time submerged, coiled in dense brush, or buried under leaf litter. Even experienced hunters using trained detection dogs, thermal imaging, and years of field experience often go entire shifts without spotting a single snake, despite population estimates running into the tens of thousands across South Florida. That difficulty is exactly why the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission and partner researchers turn to the scout snake strategy. The logic is elegant. Male pythons are driven almost entirely by scent trails during breeding season, tracking pheromone cues left by receptive females across huge distances of swamp. Researchers catch a male, surgically implant a radio transmitter, and release him back into the wild. From that point on, he does the tracking work himself, using instincts honed over millions of years, leading his handlers straight to breeding aggregations that would otherwise be nearly impossible to locate on foot. Once researchers find the group, they remove every snake they can catch, including the egg-laden females, which is critical because a single female python can lay somewhere between 50 and 100 eggs in one clutch. Removing one gravid female before she nests can, in a single afternoon, prevent the same population impact as removing dozens of individual adult snakes over the following years. This program has produced some of the most jaw-dropping python catches on record. Snakes pushing 19 feet in length, females weighing well over 200 pounds, their bodies swollen with eggs. Every one of those catches represents a genuine dent in future population growth, but the sheer scale of the invasion means human removal efforts, no matter how well designed, are fundamentally limited by the amount of terrain a hunting team can physically cover. That's part of why the predation data from native wildlife carries so much weight with researchers. Alligators don't need funding, permits, or a hunting season. They're already everywhere the pythons are, patrolling the exact same canals, sloughs, and marsh edges around the clock, every single day of the year, in numbers human teams could never match. The bobcat research adds another dimension to the picture that's easy to overlook in the viral alligator footage. A study tracking python nest predation used motion-triggered cameras set up near known python nesting sites and documented bobcats repeatedly raiding the nests, killing hatchlings as they emerged from the eggs. That's a different kind of predation than an alligator taking down an adult snake in open water. It's happening at the most vulnerable possible moment in a python's life cycle, before the animal has any size, speed, or defensive capability whatsoever. A python that never makes it out of the nest never grows into a 12-foot predator capable of doing the kind of ecological damage adult pythons have become infamous for. Every hatchling lost to a bobcat, an indigo snake, or wading bird is one less snake that will ever compete with a native predator for food, territory, or breeding opportunities down the line. There's also an underappreciated detail buried in the same research: the possible involvement of Florida black bears in nest predation. Black bears are opportunistic omnivores with an extraordinary sense of smell, more than capable of sniffing out a buried clutch of python eggs and digging it up for an easy meal. If bears are indeed contributing meaningfully to nest predation across the Everglades, it would mean at least 4 distinct native predator species: alligators, Bobcats, indigo snakes, and bears are independently exerting pressure on pythons at different stages of the snake's life cycle, from egg to adult. That kind of layered, multi-species predation pressure is exactly the sort of thing that, over enough generations, can meaningfully suppress an invasive population's growth curve, even without eliminating the species outright. None of this erases the very real danger pythons still pose, and it's worth being honest about the other side of this relationship too. Adult Burmese pythons remain fully capable of killing alligators, particularly younger or smaller individuals. Documented cases include pythons constricting alligators to death and, in some instances, attempting to swallow them afterward. The 2006 photograph of a python that burst apart trying to consume a 6-foot alligator remains one of the most viscerally shocking images ever to come out of the park, precisely because it captured just how far a python is willing to push its own limits in pursuit of prey. Pythons have also been documented preying on deer, bobcats, and even large wading birds, cementing their reputation as one of the most capable ambush predators to ever establish itself on the North American continent. The fight between alligators and pythons isn't one-sided. It's a genuine contest between two apex predators, and the outcome in any single encounter depends heavily on size, age, location, and simple luck. What the last several years of documented encounters do suggest, though, is that the overall balance of that contest may be shifting in the alligator's favor more often than anyone expected when pythons first became entrenched in the Everglades. Researchers monitoring the ecosystem describe it less as a single decisive turning point and more as an accumulation of evidence, video after video, study after study, each one adding another data point to a pattern that's becoming difficult to dismiss. As coincidence, alligators killing adult pythons in open water, bobcats and possibly bears raiding nests, indigo snakes and cottonmouths picking off juveniles, radio-tagged hatchlings turning up in alligator stomachs before researchers can even finish collecting their movement data. For an invasive species that spent its first 2 decades in Florida, facing almost no meaningful predation pressure, that shift matters. It won't undo the damage already done to the Everglades' native mammal populations, and it almost certainly won't be enough on its own to drive pythons out of South Florida entirely. But it does complicate the narrative that's dominated python coverage for years. The idea of an unstoppable invader operating in a total predation vacuum. The vacuum is closing, one encounter at a time, and the animal doing most of the closing is the same reptile that ruled these wetlands for millions of years before a single python ever slipped free of a terrarium. The swamp remembers who was here first, and more, it's starting to act like it.